There are certainly more knowledgeable historians in this room that can tell you what Vancouver was like in 1954 when it hosted the games. But I can shed a little bit of light on the sports scene at that time. It was vastly different from today. For instance, sports were still outlawed on Sundays. You could not play sports on Sundays in 1954. At least you couldn't pay to go see them. The biggest team in town was still the Canucks then, but they played in the Western Hockey League. The BC Lions wouldn't play their first football game until a few days after the Empire's best athletes left Vancouver. And the Whitecaps in professional soccer were decades away yet. The biggest sports in town were more local. Senior men's lacrosse, Capilano's baseball at Capilano Stadium, not yet Nat Bailey Stadium. Club soccer at Callister Park, which is long gone now. Senior men's and women's basketball, and there were regular boxing cards at the P&E Forum. Whenever I'm giving a tour at the Hall of Fame, when we go through the A Week You'll Remember Lifetime exhibit, there's a few stories I like to tell that really illustrate the flavor of 1954, and I'm going to share a few of them with you here. Missed a slide, sorry. On the screen here is Terry Fisher from, she was a javelin thrower from Northern Rhodesia. And you'll notice on her blazer she has a pet male galago, or a bush baby. And she named it Kafupi. And it's kind of similar to like a long-tailed squirrel, but it's a little bit more ferocious, and apparently they leap 25 feet. I don't know, I haven't seen one in person. But anyhow, Kafupi lived in Terry's blazer pocket, and kind of became Northern Rhodesia's team mascot during the games. Terry apparently won him over with bananas and chocolate. But there was one problem. When Terry arrived with the rest of her team at Vancouver Airport, and she was going through customs, little Kafupi wouldn't allow any of the customs agents to handle him. Pretty much biting anyone that stuck their hand inside her pocket. So anyhow, to kind of solve the situation, and it gives you some idea of the time, the agents just simply fast-tracked Kafupi through as meat to avoid quarantine problems. And the other interesting thing is because the male and female athletes at the games lived in separate athletes' villages, on the UBC campus. Kafupi was actually the only boy allowed to live in the women's dorms at Mary Ballard Hall. There was also, at that time, a brand new magazine that was first published that same month as the games. It was called Sports Illustrated. Its very first issue came out just days after the games ended. Night Baseball made the cover, but the lead feature story was actually the Miracle Mile, and it also included stories on Jim Peters in the marathon and Vancouver's own weightlifting dynamo, Doug Hepburn. Now that in itself was interesting, but this is what I really found interesting. Puzzled readers wrote in confused after reading this story. How could they possibly be reading a New York-based magazine complete with photographs on a Thursday when the event that had only taken place the previous Saturday afternoon thousands of miles away in Vancouver? How could this possibly happen? There was such disbelief at the speed of publishing that it prompted Sports Illustrated to print a very detailed explanation in their next issue, detailing how this technological marvel had taken place. It's a much different time. Now, unfortunately, one of the greatest concerns of most international sports events today is security. It's just a fact of life, unfortunately. The security budget for the Vancouver 2010 Winter Olympics was in the neighborhood of $1 billion. Things were a little different in 1954 when it came to security. It was virtually non-existent. You'll see up on the screen a photo of Empire Village's main gate at Acadia Camp on the UBC campus during the games. A single security guard waited in a booth on the right side of the archway as a precaution against the crowds that descended upon UBC to sightsee and gather autographs. Apparently 20,000 people showed up in one single day, and this happened for weeks. Thousands also turned out at the airport to greet athletes and literally walked right up to the wingtips of the Trans-Canada Airlines North Star planes. When I asked one athlete about what security was like during the games, she just laughed and she said, I remember two Boy Scouts holding a rope. And unfortunately, drugs and performance-enhancing drugs are another major headache today at any major international games. Again, in 1954, they were virtually unknown. When I asked Scottish swimmer Eleanor Gordon, a double gold medalist in 1954, about any recollections of drugs at the games, she again laughed and recalled that the only drug we got was a Horlicks milk tablet, and that was supply free. Up on the screen is Mike Agostini, a sprinter from Trinidad, and he's holding his gold medal in the men's 100 yards, won in Vancouver. Mike really was one of my favorite interviews during this entire process. He's down in Sydney, Australia now. He is the storyteller of all storytellers. He's a talker. He just loves to talk about that time and anything else. Really interesting guy. I call him the grand character of the 1954 games. And you'll learn, I can't get into everything, but read my book. But anyhow, I also call him the mouth that ran and the fastest mouth in the West Indies. In university, he actually worked his summers in Vancouver, and he later ran for Canada at the next British Empire and Commonwealth Games in 1958. Anyhow, I'd like to point out the blue pair of Adidas track spikes that he's holding. Adidas, of course, today is a worldwide brand, but that wasn't the case in 1954. In fact, the German company ran by Adi Dassler was then just beginning to spread overseas from Europe, and believe it or not, the 1954 games in Vancouver were really Adidas's first attempt to go global. Not many people know that. They often think that it was the 56 games in Melbourne, the 56 Olympics, but I heard from so many athletes that told me the first time they ever saw a pair of Adidas track spikes was in Vancouver at the games. And a few people, including Mike, related the story of how Horst Dassler, Adi Dassler's son, was literally walking around town with a sack of free track spikes over his shoulder, and just became a familiar sight wherever athletes were training. And he would hand out free pairs of these spikes to the athletes. He felt had a good chance to win a medal. And the idea behind it was to get some free advertising for Adidas. If these athletes won, they'd be photographed in the photo finish, crossing the finish line wearing Adidas's trademark three stripes on their feet. And that essentially was advertising and sales in 1954. Now, while we're on the topic of track spikes, I've got a photo here of a pair of leather spikes worn by North Vancouver's Bill Parnell during the games. Bill was a great man. I managed to interview him before he passed away. He served as Canada's team captain at the games and was the defending British Empire and Commonwealth Games mile champion. He had won the mile 4 years earlier in Auckland in record time. Before Adidas developed a shoe that was light and comfortable and had replaceable spikes, this is what athletes wore. Both Bill and another Vancouver runner, Doug Clement, who's still very involved in local track and field circles, running the Harry Jones Track Classic. Both Bill and Doug both told me a very fascinating story of how an athlete got top quality leather track spikes before Adidas came along. Essentially what you do is you'd get a piece of cardboard and you'd stand on it and you'd trace the outline of your feet on the cardboard. Then you cut those cardboard tracings out. And you'd mail that off with some money and return postage to one of two shoemakers in London, either GT Law and Sons or Foster's. And what these two companies would do is, from those cutouts, they'd make you a custom fitted pair of track spikes. And they would fit like a glove. They were apparently fantastic, but the work really began when they arrived in the mail. You'd have to go through weeks of soaking them in water, wearing them on your feet, wearing them in training. They literally tear your feet apart. But the idea was your feet would kind of adapt to them, and they'd eventually literally fit like a glove. They were fantastic and very light. The trouble was, if one of the spikes broke on these shoes, or were worn away by running on the cinder and dirt and grass tracks that were common at the time. Synthetic tracks were decades away. Or if the leather sides of the shoes blew out, you had to go through the entire process from the beginning. You couldn't replace them. And Adidas really, for the first time, provided these athletes with comfortable shoes straight out of the box that you could just simply screw spikes in and out. So it just changed the game. Now we don't have the time. I just don't have the time here to go into every aspect of the games organization, but I thought I'd hit on a few interesting facts and figures that touch on a few. The 1954 games were the second time Canada had actually hosted these games. Hamilton hosted the first edition in 1930, and this made Canada actually the first country to host the games twice. There were a record 24 nations here in the city during the games, and 789 athletes, coaches, and officials that attended. Lord Alexander, who was formerly Canada's Governor General from 1946 to 52, and in 1954, the Defence Minister in Winston Churchill's British cabinet officially opened the games, and that's him on the left. He wasn't the first choice of the BEG Society, the Games Organizing Committee, led by Stanley Smith, who was a realtor who worked for the World Trust and is kind of credited with opening up the British properties at that time. Smith had been hoping for Prince Philip to open the games, but when Canada's Governor General Vincent Massey learned of Philip's intention to attend, suddenly Philip's schedule changed. They wouldn't allow him to be in Vancouver on the day of the games, of the day of the opening of the games. He was required to be at Chalk River, of all places, 120 miles north of Ottawa. Why? Because he would be visiting Canada's newest atomic energy development plant at Chalk River. This was just 2 years removed from a serious nuclear meltdown. And the facility needed the good press of a smiling Duke touring the atomic reactor and proving that it was in fine working order, and trying to kind of settle down any fears of this new energy source. But Philip did arrive midway through the games, the first time a member of the royal family attended the Commonwealth Games, and he did officially close the games at the closing ceremony. A few other interesting facts and figures. The BEG Society distributed 55 million games-themed matchbooks, 5 million Dixie Cups, and 1 million bumper stickers around North America to help promote the games. There were 5,600 flags that were hung from buildings and telephone poles around the city. You can see the Woodwards building there with a few of them on the side. After autograph hunting, the official pastime during Games Week, as far as I can gather, may have been flag stealing. There are tons of stories of athletes and just average Vancouverites shimmying up flagpoles and liberating rare flags from some of the more exotic Commonwealth nations. There were also hundreds of thousands of tickets produced for the games. There's a couple examples here. $3.50 was an average price ticket at that time. The top seats for track and field went for $5 each, which many people complained was obscenely priced and out of the reach of the average person. And so not surprisingly, ticket sales actually went very slowly at first. Sam Rosen, the BEG Society member in charge of ticket sales, has this great quote, and I'm gonna read it out in full. He said, "I figured it was just a matter of getting the tickets ready, opening the door and standing back. On April 1st, we opened the door of the ticket office carefully, so as not to get hurt in the crush, and then stood back out of the way. That day, 2 people came in. 2 people. I nearly died. The games were just 4 months away, and at this rate, we might just fill a couple of phone booths." Now, some blame the emergence of television and free games coverage all week on the CBC, which had only just got on the air in Vancouver in December of 1953, when CBUT Channel 2 was established. At that time, a brand new 17-inch black and white RCA could be bought in Vancouver for a little under $200. Still expensive, but at least entering the realm of possibility for many in the middle class. But the best thing that happened to the 1954 games, and to the immense good fortune of the games organizers, was the emergence of England's Roger Bannister and Australia's John Landy in their chase of the 4-minute mile in the spring leading up to the games. Bannister, of course, broke the barrier first in May at Oxford, and Landy then broke his record just 6 weeks later in Turku, Finland. When the public realized that both would be in Vancouver and would race one another for the first time here, ticket sales literally took off. They were selling thousands of dollars of tickets in a single lunch break, I'm told. But even given the shot in the arm that the Miracle Milers provided, just under 160,000 people attended events, which sounds like a huge number, but that was only half the number of the previous games in 1950 in Auckland, and Auckland's a city half the size of Vancouver. Now, on the right side of the screen, there's a couple photos of the victory medals. Burke's Jewelers, which I noticed, they produced 400 winners' victory medals and well over 1,000 commemorative medals for the games. The victory medals on the screen. But Burke's was also commissioned to create the Unity chain link design in the bottom photo there. That appeared on the back of both medals, and it so impressed the BEG Federation that it was later adopted as the main game's emblem, and also became the standard medal design for all games for the next 40 years. But the most important figure on the minds of many was, how much are these games going to cost? That's at least the same, was the same in 2010. Then as now, the costs spiraled far higher than anticipated. First estimates were that it would cost just a few $100,000 to host the games. Final figures totaled $2.36 million, which doesn't sound like a lot, but at that time that was serious money. The breakdown of some of the higher expenses were $1.36 million for Empire Stadium alone, $300,000 for Empire Pool, $82,000 for China Creek Park, the cycling track, $117,000 for visiting team travel grants. We actually paid to get the athletes here. $76,000 for publicity, and it went on and on. These costs were covered by federal, provincial, and civic grants. There was also a $750,000 bylaw that was approved by Vancouver voters to help pay for the stadium. And a business campaign collected a few $100,000 more. But Jack Diamond really came through in the clutch. He was a local businessman who essentially ran horse racing in the city, as well as a meatpacking company. But he led a fundraising campaign that netted another $200,000, then essentially allowed the games to break even. And they raised money any which way they could. They did horse shows and cooking shows and dog contests and fashion exhibits and softball games and bingo nights and carnivals, cattle sales, dinners with celebrities, including one with Bob Hope, the comedian. They staged exhibition Canucks games. And of course there was horse racing, which raised $56,000 in one single day. Ultimately, the games made a profit of $32,000. Kind of. It depended how you interpreted the books. There was this pesky $150,000 deficit lingering about, but Stan Smith, on the right there, the general chairman, claimed that the society had no moral obligation to pay this deficit because it covered aspects of the stadium, the night lighting and the roof, that he said weren't required for the games to take place. So he just left the city on the hook for the rest. And miraculously, we turned a $32,000 profit. The budget may have ballooned, but it did provide Vancouver with 3 new world-class sports facilities. That was the biggest boost to sport that the city had ever seen to that point. Empire Stadium, seen here, seated 35,000 people and was the largest stadium in Canada at that time. The stadium became home to the BC Lions, of course, just a few days after the games, and hosted the first Grey Cup ever held in Western Canada a year later. And then, of course, it also hosted international soccer and rugby, huge concerts like the Beatles and Elvis, and as well as a host of other odd and quirky events, including a ski jumping contest in 1958. Empire Pool, which was located on beside UBC's War Memorial Gymnasium, was considered the best in Canada. And as I was talking with Colin Preston, who's in the back from the CBC, apparently it's actually finally being demolished, which is kind of sad. It's the last games venue expressly built for the games that still remains. Empire Bowl, or China Creek cycling track, as it was popularly known, with its steep 45-degree corners, became a hotbed for Canadian cycling for decades. Vancouver Community College is now located where that track was. And of course, each venue was plagued by months of controversy and public debate, and we literally do not have the time to get into the details here. But it did mean that the construction of Empire Stadium was delayed so late that it was forced to completion in just 10 months. And Empire Pool was actually moved twice. And the controversy and debate around it literally, well, not literally, but it nearly tore the city apart. It was just a swimming pool. And then we haven't even talked about the rowing course. It's a city here that's surrounded on nearly all sides by water, but they couldn't even settle on a site to row on. So the Empire Games rowing events were held, of all places, on the Vedder Canal near Chilliwack and Abbotsford. Now, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here to talk about a few of the athletes who distinguished themselves in Vancouver during the games. In my book, I tried to highlight at least one athlete from every sport. There were 9 sports that were contested at the games, and then really go into depth in who these people were, where they came from, and where they went after 1954, as well as what they did at the games. Many of the backstories that I dug up, they still amaze me years later. It really was an amazing collection of athletes here. We don't have the time here to go into every athlete or one for each sport, but I am going to talk about a few that I can highlight in more detail. On screen is the Nigerian high jumper Emmanuel Ifejuna, whose story might as well have been pulled from the pages of Ripley's Believe It or Not. He was a complete unknown when he came to Vancouver. He'd only been receiving proper coaching in the high jump for just a few months, but he was a complete natural with legs like springs. He stole the show at Empire Stadium on the opening day of track and field, winning the men's high jump with a jump of 6 feet 8 inches. That's just over 2 meters. That's essentially the height of your average doorway. That's a little bit higher than that, I can tell, but your average doorway in your home is about 6 foot 8 inches. He jumped over that. With that winning jump completed wearing 1 shoe and 1 barefoot, he had also accomplished something that had never before been achieved in high jump history. No athlete had ever leapt so high, 13.5 inches above their own height. He was only 5 foot 6. But even more importantly than that, Ifejuna had secured Nigeria's first ever gold medal in any sport in a major international games. And in that same instant, he went into the history books as the first black African athlete to claim a British Empire and Commonwealth Games gold medal, while at the same time breaking the game's high jump record. And there he is jumping it. That's actually his winning jump. Now, Emmanuel became a national hero back in Nigeria. He was actually nicknamed Emma Vancouver. But just as quickly as he burst onto the world scene, he was gone. He stopped training, and he never competed at a high level ever again. While he was at university, he became very politically motivated, and he was growing disenchanted with the country's corrupt ruling elite. He dreamt of a strong, united Nigeria where all the diverse cultures within its borders would live free and equal. And so he joined the army to carry out these revolutionary aims. On January 15, 1966, a group of officers, including Ifejuna, who was the group's ideological and intellectual mastermind, they staged a coup, codenamed Leopard, and it targeted strongholds of political power all over Nigeria. Ifejuna actually oversaw actions in the Nigerian capital, Lagos, where he personally assassinated the prime minister, reportedly after breaking into his house and kidnapping him. Now, operations in the north and west were equally successful as the rebels effectively lopped off the head of the nation's ruling elite in one cold-blooded swipe. However, troops loyal to the government rallied, and they forced a quick surrender. And Ifejuna fled to Ghana, disguised as a woman. But ironically, rather than uniting his nation, this coup actually started a bloody civil war that tore it apart. The oil-rich eastern territories took this opportunity to separate, and calling themselves the Republic of Biafra, battled Nigeria in a civil war from 1967 to 1970. Millions were killed. I talked to a couple Nigerian historians who told me that the nation still has never fully recovered from that violence. Now, Ifejuna returned to his home in eastern Nigeria during the war and served in the Biafran army as a lieutenant colonel. During a failed invasion attempt, he allegedly tried to negotiate a ceasefire with Nigerian leaders to save lives and reunite his broken homeland. The Biafran leader, General Ojukwu, considered this the ultimate betrayal. And on September 25th, 1967, Ifejuna was tied to a stake in front of a vicious mob at an army base and executed by firing squad. As one Nigerian writer told me, Nigeria's great sporting hero died a villain's death. And then there was Vancouver's world's strongest man, Doug Hepburn, who had won the heavyweight class at the 1953 World Weightlifting Championships in Sweden the year before. No Canadian has accomplished this before or since. Hepburn would cap his international career with the British Empire and Commonwealth Games gold medal in the heavyweight division in Vancouver, hoisting a games record 3-lift combined total weight of 1,040 pounds, over a half-ton. And this was even more impressive considering he accomplished this while fighting a torn quadriceps muscle suffered in training just a few days before the games ended. And you can actually see one of his legs bandaged up above the knee. Now, Hepburn remains a bit of a cult legend in Vancouver. I get visitors all the time that come to the Hall of Fame, and they tell me stories about seeing him lift the lifeguard boat at Trout Lake on his back by himself, where he worked as a lifeguard for several summers. Or they saw him perform other feats of strength, like ripping license plates apart with his bare hands, holding an anvil with one hand in the crucifix position, or bending a parking meter so that it was parallel to the sidewalk. He was incredible. As a boy, he overcame crossed eyes, shyness, and a club right foot, which actually doctors tried to repair and botched, and ended up just fusing his ankle. So you can actually see in the photo His right calf is bandaged. Essentially, he had no muscle on that leg below the knee. It was just bone and ligament. But he overcame all of these obstacles and built himself into the grandfather of modern powerlifting, as some experts, weightlifting experts today, still call him. His training programs are still cited and followed today by athletes. He also became famous for his enormous appetite while training. And many athletes told me stories about gathering around his table at Empire Village during the games, in the cafeteria, to witness this up close. And I'm gonna read out a list of what he ate at one meal, according to one athlete who recorded this. In one sitting, he consumed 7 quarts of milk, 6 boiled eggs, 5 pieces of toast, 2 bowls of pudding, 6 bananas, 6 oranges, 6 cans of tomato juice, 2 large cans of spaghetti, a bowl of soup, 2 hamburgers, and 4 large steaks. In between plates, he also apparently demonstrated his strength by performing one-arm handstands. After the games, he lived the most varied life of any 1954 British Empire and Commonwealth Games athlete. He had an unsuccessful tryout with the BC Lions, and then a short run of success in pro wrestling. But then he began drinking, and he sank into a deep depression. When things were at their darkest, he actually checked himself into New Westminster's Hollywood Hospital, and they treated his alcoholism with LSD. It was a radical procedure, but it actually proved successful. He never drank again. And after that, he ran and lost gyms, he bred huskies, he sold mail-order strength courses, he invented fitness equipment, he wrote poetry. He lost weight to become a lounge crooner, and he actually recorded several radio-friendly Christmas songs, and some are still played on the radio today. He studied Eastern spirituality. He became a philosopher, and he built arm wrestling machines. The one constant throughout all of this was weightlifting, and he lifted until his final days, setting numerous world masters records. Sadly, he died in 2000, just 3 years before the World Weightlifting Championships were held in the city, and they were actually going to honor him. That was the 50th anniversary of his World Championship. Next up is Australia's Marjorie Jackson Nelson, who was the fastest woman in history in 1954, period. Beyond breaking and re-breaking several world records, she was also a double Olympic gold medalist in 1952, winning both the 100 meters and the 200 meters. And she'd also won 4 British Empire and Commonwealth Games gold medals at the previous games in 1950. In 5 years of international competition against the best female sprinters on the planet, she had never been beaten in competition, not even in the heat. That doesn't happen in sprints. Not even Usain Bolt today will hold up in a heat. Even the greatest have off days, but not Marjorie Jackson Nelson, nicknamed the Lithgow Flash. She is still considered one of the 10 greatest sprinters of all time. In Vancouver, she added to her legend, winning 3 more British Empire Commonwealth Games gold medals. She easily took the 100 yards and the 220 yards. In the 220, she actually ran 24 seconds flat, which equaled her own world record. And it actually would prove to be the only world record performance achieved by any athlete at the Games. And then in the final race of her storied career in Vancouver, she came from behind to win the 4x110 yard relay gold medal for Australia in probably even what she said was the greatest run of her career. Her 110 yard anchor leg was timed in an incredible 10 seconds flat, which was a time few of the world's top male sprinters could have matched at that time. I also love one other story about Jackson Nelson's career. Leading up to the 1952 Olympics, her little hometown of Lithgow built for her own cinder running track for her to train on. Now, Lithgow's located in the Blue Mountains in Australia, and it's famous for these heavy fogs that roll out of the hills. The town didn't have the money to put up lights on the track for Jackson Nelson to train, so she trained by the lights of her coach's car. And she told me, sometimes you couldn't even see your hand in front of you for the fog. I'd feel with my feet and hope I was in the middle of the track and then just keep running till I banged into the car. Because you only saw the light about the last 5 meters. Looking back, I don't know how I didn't break a leg. She retired after the 1954 Games to run a sporting goods store with her husband in Australia. And later, she served as the governor of South Australia from 2001 to 2007. And then probably one of my favorite stories, if not my favorite story of the Games, involved Canada's 8's rowing crew. And I think I see a member here, if I'm not mistaken. Anyhow, the 1954 crew was represented by a young green group of UBC students rowing out of the Vancouver Rowing Club. As they told me, they were a bunch of working class students from backwoods BC towns. And if you've read the book, The Boys in the Boat, that's been a New York Times bestseller for a couple of years now. It's a story about the University of Washington rowing crew. This is the Canadian version of The Boys in the Boat. It's an amazing story. The most experienced member of that crew had been rowing just a few years, and most had been rowing just a few months. There was only one other crew in the event, but they were facing England's Thames Rowing Club, the biggest rowing club in the world at that time. On paper, at least, Britannia appeared destined to rule the better's waves. Each English crew member was on average 5 years older and nearly 10 pounds heavier than the Canadians. It was literally men versus boys. Earlier in the summer at the Henley Regatta, the Thames oarsmen had narrowly lost to the Soviet Union's reigning world champion 8 by just half a boat length. And the English could claim 6 recent high finishes or victories in significant competitions at home or in Europe. Other than a very impressive victory at the Canadian trials, the UBC boys just didn't have anything to match this. And they were holding to form at the start of this race. They got off to this terrible start and were nearly a full boat length behind after the first 100 meters. And really that should have been the end of the race right there. You don't come back from that kind of deficit that early. But the crew somehow rallied, and using superior fitness and just brute force, they just simply outrode England's finest and ended up defeating them by 2 full boat lengths. It was Canada's first gold medal in 8's rowing in any international games. Some called it the most unexpected victory of the 1954 Games, and others have since called it the greatest upset in Commonwealth Games history. It began a real rowing dynasty for the UBC and Vancouver Rowing Club group under the direction of Coach Frank Reed. As UBC VRC crews went on to finish second at the 1955 Henley Regatta on the Thames. They won gold and silver medals at the 1956 Olympics, and they defended their gold medal in the 8s at the 1958 British Empire and Commonwealth Games, as well as adding a silver at the 1960 Olympics. And I don't want to embarrass him, but I believe, is that Don, is that you?
Yes.
Yeah, Don Lachley, the team's manager, is sitting right here. Thank you for coming, Don. And then we have the Miracle Mile. This race, to give you some idea of the hype, the build-up for this race, it was actually being called the Miracle Mile weeks before it even took place, which surprised me. I thought that came after. Over 35,000 people were in attendance on Saturday, August 7th, 1954 at Empire Stadium, which was the largest paid sports crowd in Canadian history to that time. The matchup between Australia's John Landy and England's Roger Bannister, it really was a promoter's dream. It was almost too good to be true. First, you had Landy, the runner, the freshly minted mile world record holder, 12 times under 4 minutes, 6 seconds for the mile, winner in 3 of the 9 fastest mile races of all time, and unbeaten over the distance for the past 18 months. And opposing him was the only man alive with the ability at that moment to match his speed, Roger Bannister, the racer. 4 times under 4 minutes 6 seconds for the mile, the first man in history to break the 4-minute mile barrier. And perhaps most dangerously for someone of really large ambition, he was a man who suddenly had something to prove. Over 350 out-of-town journalists and photographers from over 20 countries applied for press credentials to cover this event. It would be remembered as the first sports event broadcast live coast to coast across North America on Canadian and American television via a joint CBC-NBC transcontinental hookup. An estimated 70 million watched on NBC and CBC, which is a very large sports audience for 2016. In 1954, still the early days of television, this was unheard of. Britain would have to wait for footage of the race to arrive by air. But to speed things up, the Royal Air Force actually sent a bomber to Vancouver to fly back kinescope film of the race. And there was a technician on board that was developing the film during the flight to kind of speed things up. Worldwide radio coverage in at least 3 languages included over 20 million across the US and millions more in Europe who were listening in the early hours approaching midnight, or after midnight, sorry. Scores of Australians and New Zealanders set their alarms to ensure they didn't oversleep and miss the race, which was broadcast live on the radio at 7:30 Sunday morning. There we go. So these are the 8 starters in the Miracle Mile. I'm going to really briefly go into some of the backgrounds of some, because people talk about Bannister and Landy, but almost always disregard the other competitors, and there really is some fascinating stories here. On the far left was New Zealand's Bill Bailey, a real character. He was a boat builder and a taxi driver later on. At this time, he was the youngest in the race. He was only 19. He went on to run several national records for New Zealand and set several world records in a variety of disciplines. He was a really, really well-rounded runner. Next to him is David Law, who was a runner from Oxford, and appropriately, he later became a lawyer. Ian Boyd is the next English runner down the line, and he was also an Oxford runner. Ian was a very good runner, international runner, ran at the Olympics, later moved to New Zealand and ran the New Zealand Olympic Committee down there for several years. He still lives in Auckland. Then we have Bannister, but beyond Bannister is another really fun character named Victor Milligan, who was from Northern Ireland. He was the dark horse in this race. He was a very good miler. Believe it or not, a year after the games, he was mountain climbing in Wyoming, and he fell off a cliff and fell 120 feet, landed on a rock scree on his head, and was severely injured. In fact, he was so injured, some newspapers reported him dead. A story that Murray Hallberg, one of the other milers, told me is he actually believed his friend Victor was dead for years after reading that. And it wasn't until later when Victor called him up and kind of said, you know, rumors of my demise are really exaggerated, sort of thing. But Victor actually recovered from those injuries. He had a fractured skull, he had broke his back, he was partially paralyzed. He eventually rehabilitated himself to the point where he got out of the wheelchair and walked and lived a normal life. He became a world-renowned engineer and actually lived in Toronto for the majority of his life. Some of his projects included the Don Valley Parkway in Ontario. He built the Coquitlam Dam here, and he built the Confederation Bridge in Prince Edward Island. And unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. I got one of the last interviews with him. The next down the line is New Zealand's Murray Hallberg. Now, Murray is another great character. I really like him. He's kind of New Zealand's Rick Hansen. He's just a revered figure down there. After the games, he won a very dramatic Olympic gold medal in the 5,000 meters at the 1960 Olympics in Rome. But more than that, he restarted the New Zealand Sports Awards. And at first they were called the Hallberg Trust. The idea behind the awards was that they would raise money for disabled sport. And that was very dear to his heart. Because believe it or not, Murray himself was actually partially disabled. When he was a young boy playing rugby in New Zealand, he was involved in this terrible tackle from behind that severely injured one of his arms, that virtually made it immobile. If you watch him run, and we will see it on the footage, he had this strange arm movement because of this, but from the waist down, he was as fine a runner as you'll ever see. Next to Hallberg is the Canadian Rich Ferguson. Now, Rich was the most unknown runner in the race. No one expected him to be there. Everyone expected him to finish last. And there's numerous reports attesting to that. The amazing thing about Rich is that he actually improved his mile time by over 15 seconds in the month leading up to the mile. It's unheard of at that level. So anyhow, I'm going to play a video here of the mile. After that, there's actually footage as well of Jim Peters in the marathon. We were going to break it up, but we're going to play them both because we can't separate them. And then I'll kind of sum up both races.
Had run the last lap in 59.4 seconds, and it was more than enough to give him the record. 3 minutes 59.4 seconds. No one had beaten the 4-minute barrier before. It was a great performance, and done in the days of cinder tracks, spikes and training bouts between studies. Just a myth.
Landy running short through Finland, breaking Bannister's record. Now is the original CBC broadcast footage of the mile that played in '54.
Tremendous finishing kick that is failing New Zealand, who moved into the front. Whether Vance's tremendous finishing kick in the last quarter can offset the blistering pace that Landy likes to set. Landy is currently running fourth, Bannister is behind him. Bailey of New Zealand is still the number one man. They are down the middle of the backstretch. England represented by David Law has moved in front. Has made a move early that has got the crowd gasping up a little bit and wondering what kind of a pace he is going to try and set. John Landy of Australia, unofficially the world record holder at 3:58, set in circuit Finland, is the number one man right now. We'll give you quarter by quarter time. Landy is leading at least 5 yards. Approximately 58.6 unofficially for the first quarter. The race is out now. Is Landy going to hold it all the way around? And if he does, can he offset Bannister's tremendous last quarter? Bannister actually in a slow mile race won time 53 and 8/10 seconds for the last lap. A colossal final quarter. The lead remains the same. And Mr. Bannister is not going to be up distance too far. He is the number 2 man. Landy's pony is coming around the turn. If anything, it may have been lengthened just a little bit. The Hallberg is running third, Rich Ferguson of Tennessee right far ahead. As they come down the stretch for the half-mile mark.
This one goes to start. here, and a short slip-style landing, like the powerful, majestic striding of Roger Bannister. And there is landing past the half-mile mark, with Roger Bannister 10 yards behind, and closing up on him, I think. Landing still 10, 15 yards to the lead. Roger Bannister closing, I think, and Richie Ferguson of Canada is in third place. This is really a big surprise. Richie Ferguson of Canada, 15 yards behind Bannister. But now Bannister is closing. Bannister is closing on landing with 2.5 laps to this race gone. There can now only 5, 6 yards between them. Landing looks to me as he's tiring just a little. That's a shame. Roger Bannister is striding magnificently there. A lap on fourth to go. Roger Bannister is closed on John Landing.
Just chat about Bannister's
Landing in the lead, and Roger Bannister just behind him. This is going to be a magnificent race. Richie Ferguson of Canada is still third. He's away left. He's got a good chance of finishing third, though, I feel. With 1 lap to go. This must be the greatest mile race any of us have seen. John Landy still in first place, striding easily. I feel it's Roger Bannister's race. I feel certain it's Roger Bannister's race. Very easily. And I think soon we shall see the famous Bannister's first. John Landy, he's got 2 yards ahead of Roger Bannister still, and there's less than half a lap to go. 200 yards. Roger Bannister still on John Landy's heels, staying in very close. 150 yards to go, John Landy still leads, Roger Bannister second. The crowd are getting up to mad here. Roger Bannister is coming to the lead. Roger Bannister is fighting away. The most magnificent win. Roger Bannister has 5 yards on John Landy, 6 yards, 7 yards. The race is all over. Roger Bannister, sky clear of a winner of this magnificent final race. Look at George, John Landy second.
Had never been seen publicly in Canada until it was exhibited at the BC Sports Hall of Fame. This actually came from an Australian filmmaker. Just entering the stadium now. Incredible height. The mile exceeded all expectations, and many still consider it the greatest foot race that has ever been run. It's a little remembered fact today that a Canadian finished third in the mile, Rich Ferguson. He ran a Canadian record 4 minutes, 4 seconds that day, and in my opinion, it still ranks as one of the most underrated Canadian running performances of all time. For that particular day, Saturday, August 7th, it was The mile is probably the biggest news story, not just sports story, news story in the world. I don't know how often Vancouver or anywhere in BC or Canada, for that matter, can even claim that. Bannister wins greatest mile race of all, heralded the Times of London. The Melbourne Age called it the race of all time and the world's greatest ever athletic spectacle. The Sydney Morning Herald claimed nothing like this race has been seen in the history of athletic competition. The Globe and Mail deemed the race the most publicized sports event of any era. The New York Times said this is competitive sport at its very best. And leave it to the Vancouver Sun sports editor, Erwin Fongard, to outdo everybody in the hyperbole department, as he was wont to do. He claimed Saturday, Vancouver was the center of the universe. And for once, no one argued with it. I found headlines and photos of the mile in the following American newspapers: the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, the Christian Science Monitor, to name but a few of hundreds. Despite the fact not a single American athlete was running in the entire game, let alone in this particular race. It was unprecedented. Today, when the Commonwealth Games happens, the Americans just, it goes by without even a blip in the U.S., but at that time it was huge. Sports Illustrated, Time Magazine, and Life Magazine all carried feature stories on the mile. Both Roger Bannister and John Landy were brought back numerous times to Vancouver on several occasions to celebrate their historic race. A 3-meter high bronze statue was unveiled in 1967 at Empire Stadium, of that famous look back. And today it stands near the final corner where Bannister passed Landy so dramatically at Empire Field Sports Park. Roger Bannister went on to be knighted and became a world-renowned neurologist, while Landy worked as an environmental conservationist and served as the governor of the state of Victoria from the year 2000 to 2006. Both remain among the most revered athletes in their respective nations' histories. And then we'll get into the marathon. So less than 30 minutes later, as you saw, another event would sear itself into the memories of those in attendance even more vividly than Bannister and Landy's epic struggle. And for me, this was perhaps the biggest surprise of all my research. Everyone, of course, remembered the mile, and it exceeded all expectations, but those who were there were more emotionally impacted by the marathon. I mean, what would you say, Don?
No question, I was there.
Yeah. The marathon just affected people in a totally different way.
England's Jim Peters, he came to Vancouver as the greatest marathon runner in history, beginning with his first marathon in 1951 at the age of 32, and continuing over the next 3 years, he produced an unprecedented series of winning results. Running in the only athletic shoes available at that time, canvas and rubber Woolworths plimsolls, which you can see at the BC Sports Hall of Fame. We have the shoes he ran in. They offer little support and even less cushioning. But he managed to break the world's best time on 4 separate occasions. He was the first man to go under the 2-hour, 20-minute barrier for the marathon. And ultimately, he lowered the world mark by over 7 minutes to 2 hours, 17 minutes, 39 seconds, which is still to this day the largest margin that any single athlete has lowered the world marathon mark. His only setback was a devastating Olympic failure in 1952, when he failed to finish the race, going in as the gold medal favorite. The 1954 Games loomed large for him. They were his final chance to prove that he could rise to the occasion in a big international meet. But there were a few things working against Jim Peters that day. The British Empire and Commonwealth Games marathon route was tough. I've walked it personally. I intend to run it someday. I'm going to have to train. But it features many steep hills and climbs. Also, many would later cite August 7th, 1954 as the hottest day of that year in Vancouver. Officially, it peaked in the early afternoon at 28 degrees Celsius, but out on the exposed pavement of Vancouver streets where he was running, it felt closer to a humid 38 degrees Celsius. And as was his habit, Jim Peters drank no water while running. It upset his stomach, apparently. So in fact, at that time, many marathoners were actually eating salt tablets, thinking that this would replenish the salt that they lost through sweating, which was true. It also dehydrated them even more. Now there's some debate whether Jim actually ate salt tablets that day. Some athletes remembered him doing so, others said no, I'm not sure. But regardless, his teammates warned him to take it slow due to the heat in the hills. And for the most part, he did. He actually ran slower than he was capable of. But he spent much of the race worried by his English teammate Stan Cox, who was probably the #2 marathoner in the world at that time, and he was trailing close behind him all race. Cox ended up falling into a ditch and hitting his head on a telephone pole, failing to finish. The heat got to him as well. Over half the field succumbed to the heat in the hills that day. There was only 8 that finished the race. Peters himself was feeling very poorly when he wobbled into the stadium, as we saw. And he entered Empire Stadium's gates in 2 hours and 23 minutes, which was just a little bit over world record pace. Still to this day, that is an excellent marathon time. According to witnesses, he collapsed semi-conscious anywhere from 12 to 20 times on the cinder track, staggering drunkenly, crawling at times, laying in the shade at others. Reactions of witnesses run the gamut. Some wept, others turned away unable to watch, and a few were visibly sick, including one reporter who vomited at trackside. Many called for the race to be stopped, but English officials wouldn't allow anyone to touch him for fear he'd be disqualified. It took 10 minutes for him to go 200 yards around partway the track. Normally Jim would run 2 miles in that time. Before the English team masseur, Mick Mays, finally had enough and pulled him off the track, as we saw. There was some confusion about whether he'd actually crossed the finish line or not. And it turned out the finish line for the marathon was actually on the other side of the track. So he was disqualified. He was helped before the finish line. He was 200 yards short of his goal. Scotland's Joe McGee trotted in 16 minutes later and won the race in 2 hours 39 minutes, but was totally overshadowed by Peters' shocking collapse. Doctors at Shaughnessy Hospital placed Peters in an oxygen tent where saline solution and dextro were fed into him, but he vomited repeatedly and passed in and out of consciousness. It took several hours before any sensation returned to his legs, and 6 hours for a leg cramp to straighten. Watched over by several doctors, including the newly minted medical doctor Roger Bannister himself. Peters gradually recovered over 5 days in bed, and he returned home. He was fine, but he never would run in a race again. That was his last time. For the remainder of his life, he worked as an optician before passing away in 1999. Now, it's a little known story. Peters was actually brought back to Vancouver as well. The same year Bannister and Landy were brought back, and they held a ceremony for him at halftime of a BC Lions game where they had him trot out the final half lap of his race, completing the marathon 13 years after he ran it. And again, people that were there told me people were just in tears. It was just so emotional. Here's some photos actually of different stages of Peters' collapse. So very briefly, what was the legacy of the 1954 British Empire Commonwealth Games on Vancouver and BC sport? Well, first, Vancouver was elevated as a destination on the world sports map. It was now a city capable of hosting big events successfully, and it was no coincidence that in 20 years after the Games, the city became home to 3 major professional sports teams that are now deeply entrenched in the fabric of Canadian sport. The CFL's BC Lions, the NHL's Vancouver Canucks, and the NASL MLS Vancouver Whitecaps. Secondly, the Games effectively engaged a significant percentage of Vancouver and BC's population, unlike any event before and very few since. Third, on an individual level, the lasting effects for those involved elevated many to places of honor. At least 50 individuals who took part in the games in some capacity ended up inducted into the BC Sports Hall of Fame, and another 15 into Canada's Sports Hall of Fame. Fourth, no one could discount the physical legacy left by the Games in the form of the athletic facilities built for the Games and then used to the benefit of pro and amateur athletes for the next 3 decades. And finally, the spirit that swept over Vancouver in 2010 for the Winter Olympics could very well have been the biggest legacy left behind by the 1954 British Empire and Commonwealth Games. In 2010, Vancouver dropped its characteristic laid-back disinterest, and it really, we proved to be a city that got behind big events to an extraordinary extent. Vancouverites painted the town Canadian red. We welcomed the world with open arms, red mittens, and warm smiles. The spirit with which they took to the Games, we took to the Games, stunned, even hardened Olympic observers. But for those who were there and experienced it the first time around in 1954, it was no surprise at all. Like that 1954 billboard at the start of the presentation said, it really had been a week that you'll remember a lifetime. And I'd just like to thank you all for coming, listening to me ramble on about this. Thank you to Michael and Bruce Watson and the Beck Historical Society. I hope you've enjoyed a taste of what you'll see read in my upcoming book. The Miracle Mile comes out in April. I have some pamphlets here if you'd like for some more information. And also, please come down to the BC Sports Hall of Fame and walk through the A Week You'll Remember a Lifetime exhibit before it comes down in July. It is, like I said, one of the best things we've ever done, and this is just a taste of what you'll see.